Everything you think you know about the Mayan calendar is probably wrong. Not because ancient Mesoamerican astronomers were hiding secret knowledge about the end of the world, but because modern pop culture took a single date, attached a wildly inaccurate meaning to it, and spent 2 decades selling us the story. Now an AI system reportedly trained on thousands of Mayan glyphs, codices, and inscriptions has been used to re-examine the entire calendar system from scratch. And according to one speculative interpretation of its output, the actual endpoint of the long count, if you take certain assumptions seriously, falls somewhere in 2026. Not as a prediction of doom, as a theory. Let us sit with that theory carefully and pull it apart. First, a quick reality check, because this matters. The Mayan calendar did not predict the end of the world in 2012. It did not predict the end of the world at all. The much-hyped date of December 21, 2012, marked the completion of one 13-Bactan cycle in a longer counting system called the long count. A Bactan is a unit of roughly 394 years. 13 of them make up one great cycle. When that cycle ends, another one begins. The way our calendar rolls over from December 31st to January 1st, or, on a longer scale, the way a century or millennium ends and another starts. The Maya themselves never wrote anywhere that the world would stop when the 13th Bactan closed. That interpretation came from modern authors in the 20th century, not from any Mayan source. Scholars including Dr. Anthony Aveni of Colgate University, one of the foremost experts on Mayan astronomy, spent years trying to correct the record before 2012. The world, as you may have noticed, did not end on December 21, 2012. Life continued. The Maya shrugged. And the apocalypse industry moved on to the next date. It is worth stopping here to name that pattern explicitly because it keeps repeating. Every few decades, a new date gets attached to some ancient civilization's calendar or prophecy, and a wave of speculative content floods the internet around it. The year 2000 was supposed to crash civilization through Y2K. The year 2012 was supposed to bring planetary alignment and earthquakes. Various Hopi, Zoroastrian, Norse, and biblical interpretations have been cited over the years to anchor various end-of-the-world timelines. None of them have come to pass. The pattern tells us something about human psychology more than it tells us about ancient cultures. We are, as a species, fascinated by deadlines, especially deadlines we did not set ourselves. Keep that in mind as we unpack the 2026 claim. So why are we now hearing about 2026? The story starts with the kind of experiment that has become possible only in the last few years. A research team, working with publicly available datasets including the surviving Mayan codices, glyph inventories from various archaeological sites, and reconstructions of the long count correlation, used a large language model with a vision component, reportedly in the Grok family, to read and cross-reference Mayan calendrical inscriptions at scale. The goal, as described in informal summaries circulating online, was not to predict the end of the world. The goal was to see whether the AI could detect inconsistencies or patterns in how the Maya track time, particularly around the correlation between their long count and the modern Gregorian calendar. The correlation question is old and unresolved. For over a century, scholars have debated how exactly to align the long count with our calendar. The dominant correlation, known as the GMT correlation after its proponents Goodman, Martinez, and Thompson, pegs the Mayan creation date, known as 4 Ajah A Kumq, to August 11, 3114 BC. Under this alignment, the 13th Bactan ended on December 21, 2012. Most mainstream Mayanists accept this correlation, supported by radiocarbon dating, astronomical alignments mentioned in the codices, and ethnographic records from the colonial period. But not everyone has agreed. Alternative correlations have been proposed over the decades, shifting the long count anywhere from a few days to a few centuries away from the GMT number. Most of these alternatives have been rejected on strong evidence. A few have persisted in niche scholarly discussions, usually framed around specific astronomical events that the mainstream correlation seems to miss or misalign. This is where the AI analysis allegedly comes in. According to one interpretation making the rounds, the model flagged apparent inconsistencies between certain inscriptions and the GMT correlation. Specifically, eclipse records, Venus cycles, and solar zenith passages recorded in the Dresden Codex and on inscriptions at sites like Palenque and Copan were compared to computed astronomical events. The model reportedly found that some of these records fit a slightly different correlation, one, in which the 13th Bacton would not have ended in 2012, but somewhere roughly 14 years later. In other words, if you adopt this alternative correlation, 2026 becomes, under the theory, the completion of the long count cycle. This is the claim. It needs to be taken apart very carefully, because several things are true at once. 1. The alternative correlation idea is not new. Scholars have floated correlations near this range before, without AI assistance. The so-called Behem correlation, for example, proposed by Czech astronomer Bohumil Behem in the 1990s, shifts the long count by roughly 208 years, pushing the cycle end into the 23rd century, not 2026. Other alternative proposals cluster around different dates. None of them are widely accepted. The mainstream GMT correlation remains the standard because it matches the largest number of independent lines of evidence, including post-conquest calendar survivals still practiced in some Maya communities today. 2. The AIS output, as described in public summaries, does not include a rigorous scholarly case for a new correlation. It shows a pattern, a set of alignments, and leaves the interpretation to whoever is reading the summary. Taking that interpretation and announcing 2026 as, quote, the actual end date, end quote, is not a scientific conclusion. A compelling one, perhaps, but not a proof. 3. Even if an alternative correlation were correct, the end of a Bacton cycle is not the end of the world. It is the end of a unit of counting. The Maya recorded dates that extended far beyond their current great cycle, into units called pictons and calabtuns that measured time in multiples of thousands of years. Inscriptions at Palenque, specifically on the Temple of the Inscriptions, reference events that would occur on dates equivalent to the year 4772 AD. If the Maya thought time was ending in their near future, they would not have bothered carving dates thousands of years into hours. The long count was a counter, not a countdown. That Palenque inscription, by the way, is not obscure. It is right there, on the sarcophagus of King Paykul, one of the most famous archaeological monuments in the Americas. The carving projects a celebration of Paykul's anniversary into a future so distant that no human alive then or now would witness it. This is not the writing of a civilization that believed cosmic time was about to stop. It is the writing of a civilization that believed its kings should be remembered for millennia. With those 3 points established, we can now engage with the theory more openly because there is something genuinely interesting sitting underneath the sensational framing. The Maya were, by any reasonable measure, among the most accomplished astronomers of the ancient world. They tracked the motion of Venus with an accuracy that modern instruments confirmed centuries later. They predicted eclipses. They identified cycles that repeat every few decades and used them to organize religious ceremonies, agricultural calendars, and political events. The surviving codices, particularly the Dresden Codex now held in Germany, contain tables of planetary motion and eclipse predictions that work with real accuracy over centuries. If a modern AI, trained on that material, is flagging patterns that suggest the conventional correlation may have small errors, that is genuinely worth exploring. Not because it means anything ominous, but because it would refine our understanding of how the Maya tracked time. Even small correlation errors matter because they affect how we match archaeological events to historical ones, how we interpret inscribed dates, and how we reconstruct the intellectual achievements of a civilization that produced one of the most sophisticated pre-modern calendar systems on the planet. The theory that 2026 marks some specific cycle completion under an alternative correlation is a speculative idea. It is not a prediction. It is a hypothetical. And speculative ideas in science are not useless. They are how we stress test what we think we know. Here is what the more careful version of the theory actually says, as far as it has been published in accessible form. One of the most reliable anchoring points in any long count. Correlation is the set of Venus cycle records in the Dresden Codex. Venus, in Mayan cosmology, was a central and ominous deity associated with warfare and kingship. The Codex contains a table of Venus morning star and evening star appearances that stretches across several centuries. If you apply the GMT correlation, these appearances line up fairly well with modern astronomical computations within a small margin of error. If you apply certain alternative correlations, they line up slightly differently. The AI analysis, as summarized, reportedly suggested a very small shift in the correlation on the order of days or weeks that improves some astronomical fits while worsening others. A shift of days or weeks does not get you from 2012 to 2026, which is part of the problem with the popular framing of this story. To arrive at 2026 as the end of the 13th Bacton, you need a shift of roughly 14 years, and there is no widely accepted evidence supporting a shift of that magnitude. The popular version of the theory has essentially compressed several different claims into one, combining a modest correlation adjustment with a dramatic date shift in a way that the underlying analysis does not actually support. This is how these stories often work. A technical finding gets translated into a headline, the headline gets translated into a video, and by the time it reaches most people, the original claim has transformed into something much larger and much simpler than what the research actually said. Still, it is worth asking, as a thought experiment, what it would mean if any end-of-cycle date, be it 2012 or 2026 or some other year, carried the significance the popular imagination wants it to carry. The Maya themselves, the ones currently alive, provide some of the best perspective on this. Maya communities across Guatemala, Belize, and southern Mexico still use versions of the traditional calendar for religious and agricultural purposes. Many of these communities regard cycle completions as significant moments of renewal, not destruction. A time to reflect, to reset intentions, to honor ancestors. The ending of a cycle, in this worldview, is not the ending of existence. It is a pause, a breath, a threshold between what was and what is coming. Living Maya datekeepers called Achkij in Maya still maintain the 260-day ritual calendar called the Zocan, pairing it with the 365-day solar calendar to form the calendar round that has been in continuous use for well over 2,000 years. Each day of the Zocan carries its own name, its own energy, its own guidance. Ceremonies are held. Offerings are made. Children are named according to the day they were born. This is not a dead system recovered from ruins. This is a working tradition that has outlasted the Spanish conquest, the colonial era, decades of civil war, and the pressures of modernity. If anyone on the planet has standing to speak about the meaning of Maya time, it is these communities. And they are, by and large, uninterested in apocalypse narratives that alone should carry weight. In December 2012, Maya elders at several sites held ceremonies to mark the completion of the 13th Bacton. They did not prepare for the end of the world. They prepared for the beginning of a new cycle. That was always the indigenous framing. The doomsday narrative was imported. If 2026 does hold some calendrical significance under an alternative correlation, the appropriate response, in the spirit of the tradition the calendar came from, would not be panic. It would be attention. A willingness to look at the year, notice what it brings, and carry on with the work of being human. Cycles end. Cycles begin. This has always been true. The skeptical view is important to articulate clearly here. Dr. Mark Van Stone, author of 2012, Science and Prophecy, of the Ancient Maya, spent years debunking the original 2012 apocalypse narrative. His core argument was that the Maya simply did not write about the end of the world in the way modern popularizers claimed. The surviving inscriptions are overwhelmingly about kings, wars, marriages, and religious ceremonies, not about cosmic endings. Extending that same skeptical framework to 2026, or to any other date proposed by an AI-assisted reanalysis, is reasonable, until there is peer-reviewed scholarship supporting a major correlation revision. The default position should be that the mainstream dating still stands, and that the 13th Bacton already ended. The burden of proof, in other words, remains on the alternative theory, not on the consensus. What the AI analysis may legitimately have done is give us new tools to explore old questions. Machine learning models can comb through thousands of glyphs in ways that would take human researchers decades. They can spot patterns, test correlations, and flag inconsistencies. That is genuinely useful for Mayan scholarship, which has historically been a field of careful, slow work performed by a relatively small number of specialists. Opening the codices and inscriptions to large-scale computational analysis could, over the coming years, produce real refinements in our understanding of how the calendar worked. It will not, however, produce apocalypse predictions. And any source telling you it has should be read with a very healthy dose of caution. It is also worth being honest about how AI models can mislead in this particular field. Large language models are excellent at pattern completion. If you ask one about Mayan calendar correlations, it will confidently produce text that references real scholars, real codices, and real terminology. But it may also invent correlations that do not exist, misattribute arguments to the wrong researchers, or generate numerical alignments that look plausible but do not hold up to verification by an actual domain expert. This is not a flaw unique to any specific model. It is a consequence of how these systems work. They generate what sounds right, not what is true. A claim about 2026 that originates primarily in AI-generated summaries without independent scholarly validation should be treated as a hypothesis to investigate, not as a discovery to announce. So what should you actually do with the 2026 theory? Treat it as a conversation, not a warning. Enjoy the intellectual exercise of thinking about how ancient astronomers tracked time. Appreciate the difficulty of matching their system to ours. Notice how often, throughout history, people have projected their anxieties onto distant cultures and read doom into symbols those cultures never intended that way. The Maya had their own preoccupations. They were not waiting around to scare us. If 2026 passes and nothing particularly extraordinary happens, that will not disprove the careful scholarly work being done on the calendar. It will just confirm what the Maya themselves seem to have understood all along. Time does not end. It unfolds. The cycles keep turning. And our job, whoever we are and whenever we live, is to keep paying attention. The calendar in the codices is not a countdown. It is a mirror. It shows us a civilization that took the sky seriously, that tracked centuries with care, and that left us with a counting system so elegant we are still arguing about how to read it 500 years after the last great city fell. Whether the 13th Bakhtin ended in 2012, ends in 2026, or turns out to have ended on some entirely different day we have not yet calculated correctly, the Maya achieved something remarkable. That achievement deserves more than a doomsday headline. What is your take on this one? Do you lean toward the mainstream correlation, or do you find the alternative interpretations worth a second look? Either way, the calendar keeps turning. And somewhere in the highlands of Guatemala, someone lit a candle this morning for reasons that have nothing to do with any of our predictions. There is a further point worth making about how these theories spread because the mechanism matters as much as the content. A speculative correlation reanalysis gets posted to a forum. An AI-generated summary amplifies it. A video creator frames it as breaking news. Thousands of viewers encounter the claim without ever seeing the original caveats. By the time academic specialists notice, the narrative has already hardened in public memory. This is not unique to the Mayan calendar. The same pattern has played out around DNA discoveries, archaeological finds, astronomical anomalies, and ancient texts. The internet rewards certainty, and certainty is almost always more viral than careful hedging. Knowing this should change how we consume these stories. When you see a confident claim about an ancient civilization predicting a specific, modern year, treat the confidence itself as a warning sign. If the research community ever does establish a revised correlation for the long count, whether the new date lands in 2026, 2027, or somewhere else entirely, it will be announced through peer-reviewed papers, conference proceedings, and the slow work of scholarly consensus. Not through clickbait, not through breathless AI summaries, not through apocalyptic countdowns. In the meantime, the mainstream GMT correlation remains the default. The long count cycle ended in 2012, and the 13th Bakhtin became the 14th without incident. Human beings have a long habit of seeking meaning in numbers. The Maya understood this better than most. They built a calendar that invited contemplation of time itself. Letting that invitation become a doom prediction misses the point of what they built. The calendar is not about fear, it is about attention. And attention, practiced with care, has always been a gift across any culture that has taken time seriously. Look up at the sky tonight. Notice Venus if you can find it. Notice the moon. Notice the slow turn of seasons that those same ancient astronomers tracked and celebrated. The year 2026, whatever it brings, will unfold the way years always unfold. Some things will surprise us, most will not. And through all of it, somewhere the calendar will keep turning, as it has for thousands of years, patient and indifferent to our predictions.